name's Annabel Williams. I'm a financial journalist, and I recently wrote a book, which is the name of this event. I'm joined here tonight by Jo Fairley, a businesswoman who founded Green and Black's Chocolate in 1991. It's now close to becoming a brand worth £100 million. And we have Tracey Bleakley to my immediate right. She's a female CEO, a chartered director and board member of the Primadonna Festival. We have one other guest who's joining us, but she's been held up in traffic, and that is Jude Kelly, who founded the WOW festivals, which are for women. And more recently, she has set up Smart Purse, which is a kind of financial education platform aimed at women. So just to start off with, we're going to talk. I'm going to start off with a discussion of the book, and then we can talk to the panel, and we will have time for questions. I don't know how long we'll go on for, it depends on how many questions we have, but if you do need to head out to the next session, then by all means go ahead. So to kick things off, I wanted to start with an explanation of how this book came about. So the title is Why Women Are Poorer Than Men. And it all began when I started out in financial journalism 15 years ago. I became really acutely aware of a phrase that's used all the time in finance, and that's women don't like risk, which I found really strange. I mean, what women? Who are you talking about? But it's basically supposed to say something about why women don't really invest that much money in the stock market compared to men, and the way women are as leaders and their aptitude to risk. Now, let's look at this, right? When you say that women aren't into risk with their money, that just ignores the socio-economic circumstances that many women find themselves in. And studies show that when they've got the money, they do take risk. That's exactly what people who are higher earners and women who've received inheritances do. And the second point is, when it comes to female leaders, well, we've only had a handful of female heads of states in the Western world. They're under extra scrutiny and exposure because of their femaleness. So if they are more risk averse, then I think that's fair to explain why. Later, the pay gap began to hit the headlines. This isn't a discussion that we would have had, I think, 10 years ago. It's really thanks to the campaigners who brought the pay gap into the spotlight that we're able now to talk about women and money much more openly. It's fantastic that there's been so much talk about the pay gap. The problem is that what has happened is that there's been no substantive change. There's been nothing incumbent on companies or employers to pay people fairly, and that isn't just women, that's anybody that may be subject to discrimination for whatever reason. Instead, what's happened is that larger companies, and it's only the minority of companies, now have to produce a pay report on gender pay at their businesses. This has been in place, I think, so last year it had been in place for 3 years, and companies had been allowed to delay or not produce this report. It was dropped during the pandemic, which just goes to show how much weight that just doing another bit of research kind of has. It's not seen as very important at all. I mean, getting companies to kind of put out another report, I don't think is real change that actually affects the lives and the incomes of the millions of women working in this country today. The problem with this is also that what has really come about is this trope that people say it a lot, that men earn more than women because they negotiate their salaries. Women never negotiate. There are all sorts of articles and podcasts and workshops that are, ask for what you're worth. And this is great. It's really great that there are women trying to help one another and share what they've learned. But at the same time, are we really going to solve a structural problem by asking individual women to go to their boss, who may well be a woman, middle management, who's then going to go to senior management, more likely to be male, and then give them a pay rise? You're asking individual women to solve structural inequality on their own. This is a problem that transcends industry, it transcends history. And when women do get together collectively, as we've seen with the nurses most recently, when they try to negotiate their pay as a collective, they're just fobbed off. I was writing this book last year during the pandemic, and as the nation clapped for carers from their windows, I wondered, is that the best we could do? Now, I also wanted to point out that aside from the fact that It's actually not true that women don't negotiate their pay. There's lots of research that says that women do. They're just less likely to be given those pay rises. It's also this kind of concept that, maybe there's something about women that we need to change within ourselves. Maybe if we were just a bit better at things. I mean, this is essentialism. It's basically saying that, men have used tact and guile and diplomacy to, artfully negotiate a better pay package. Well, where were all the girls? Were they off school that day that those particular lessons were taught? And then, of course, the fact that there's no transparency over wages, so people don't actually know what they're campaigning for. Now, what I wanted to do when I wrote this book was to basically address this problem of structural inequality. So, from my work as a financial journalist, I'm very well aware that women are poorer than men from cradle to grave. 90% of single parents are women, a lot of them barely scrape by. It may surprise you to learn that while the country's 5,000 odd rough sleepers are mostly men, women are actually the majority of the statutory homeless. It's not safe for them to be on the streets, so it's hidden homelessness. This is the cohort of women who are moved between council-funded bed and breakfast to women's refuge to just a place of no fixed abode. So 70% of the legally homeless are women. When we put up buildings and we try to tackle the housing crisis by building new flats, and we don't build social housing, predominantly affects women because they are the ones who are more reliant on social housing. I found out that the NHS actually spends more money per year on Viagra than it does on the scheme that helps single mothers buy fruit and vegetable for their children. I don't know why I'm grinning. I've said this so many times that I don't even find it serious anymore. It's just ridiculous. And of course, this kind of sexism, with just women not being entitled to money, it also kind of translates into the boardroom. So we know there's been lots of talk about what women should do in business and how we can all get better jobs. Well, women entrepreneurs struggle with sexist questions when they are trying to raise money for their business, and as a result, just 1p in every pound of capital given to early stage businesses goes to female-led enterprises. So there's quite a lot in there, and we have two chief executives and entrepreneurs with us, and of course Jude, who's joining us shortly, I hope. She's held up in traffic. So lots to talk about, and I also wanted to add that whilst we are going to be talking about the things that people can do as individuals to better themselves with their money, we can't give financial advice, so I'm afraid if you've got questions about what to do with your inheritance or whether you should invest in bonds, legally we can't do that. The government or the regulators even make a distinction between financial advice, which you need to pay for, and guidance. So yeah, guidance is what we're calling it. Well, to start off with, let's talk to... I want to turn to you, Tracey, because you were behind the campaign to get financial education in schools. So what was the resistance to actually having that?
Interestingly, at first, it was the government. So the government would always come back to us and say, we don't want to be nanny state, let children be children. So we keep coming back and saying, well, we can prove the parents want financial education. Oh, the teachers won't. So we went to the teaching union and the teachers, and they said it's much easier to teach maths if you're teaching financial education, because kids really want to know how to save up for that leather jacket they want and how much kebab every week is costing them and what else they could spend the money on. So actually it was a much better way of teaching maths all the way through to complex investments and playing games around investing on the stock market in schools. But the interesting thing was, although the parents said teach our kids about money, when we went back and said, okay, but what you can also do is go through the family budget. Tell your kids how much you earn and tell them, go through what goes out of your bank account every month and what you're left with. And they sort of looked at each other and said, we can't tell our kids how much we earn, that's private. and we can't tell them how much things really cost, they'd be really worried. Well, if you can't tell your kids how much things really cost, how are you possibly going to expect them to be able to budget in real life? And how are you possibly going to expect them to be able to plan for their future? So I think that was one of the big things, that we don't talk as a society about money. We would much rather talk about death, which is what I do now for a living, we'd much rather talk about sex, but we will not share what we spend on things because we think it's impolite and rude, and we're just a little bit scared about it. So that was the biggest area of resistance that I found fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, a really interesting point, that especially as women, I think that one of the things that holds us back from understanding and really properly managing money is that most women don't have mothers, sisters or aunts who work in finance, so they're not having conversations about interest rates or the stock market and, you know, macroeconomics and that kind of thing. But, you know, at the same time, there's this huge cultural taboo about talking about money. I mean, most people would talk to their best friends about, you know, sex, all sorts of things, but probably don't know how much each other earns. So, I mean, I know this is something that you're quite keen on discussing, Jo. So, why do you think we're so bad at talking about money, and how have you gone about tackling it?
I can't explain why we're so bad at talking about money, but I recently had an experience where I was pitching for a job of work and I thought I knew what I should be charging a client for it. And I thought I would check with a friend of mine who'd just done exactly the same job for somebody. And so I rang her up, she's one of my best friends, and I said, how much did you get for doing X? And she said, oh, I'd really rather not say. It's like, you're my best friend and you won't discuss the fee you got. And it's just, we've got to stop this, because not knowing all these things, being embarrassed about it somehow, you know, the more we talk about money, the more comfortable every woman is going to be, every person is going to be discussing it.
And so, I just want to ask, with your best friend, I mean, how did you respond in the moment?
Well, in the end, I told her what I was pitching, and she said, yes, that's exactly what I got, actually. And I was like, oh, could you not say that? It was really nice to know that I was right. But yeah, it was just extraordinary that somebody I know that well would not share what she earned.
Yeah, when I was writing the book, I did quite a lot of research into the psychology of money, and one of the things that really surprised me, and saddened actually, is that if you want to stay friends with your friends over the life course, one of the best things you can do is not earn more money than them, because people don't like it. People tend to basically just stay with a friendship group that's got the same amount of money as them. And if you don't tell people, it's actually worse, because they can tell, they can sniff it out. And this, I think, really speaks to the cultural taboo that we have around money, that people are so uncomfortable. Now, Jo, right, you've done pretty well in business. Have you ever had anyone come and ask you for money? And if so, how have you dealt with it?
Yes, and this is going to sound awful, but actually I don't lend people money anymore. I have done very well, and I always say I worked incredibly hard basically I've worked hard my entire career. From the age of 17, and everything I have now, I worked fucking hard for. People do come to you when you have a certain, you know, lifestyle, and they ask to borrow money. And I used to lend money to people, and every single person I have lent money to, and we're not talking, I mean, the most was about £3,000. It has just destroyed that relationship with them. And one of them was a brother who didn't speak to me for 5 years, because what happens when you lend people money is that they resent you for it on some level. And actually now, if I will give money to people with no strings attached, and you know, if someone really needs it, but I will never lend it to them, because it makes it changes the dynamic of the whole relationship.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I can imagine. So Tracey, you grew up in the Northwest, also done well for yourself, of course. Can you tell us about some of the lessons that you learnt about money as you were growing up and through your career?
Yeah, so I grew up a family of very strong women. In fact, the reason my granddad proposed to my gran was when he first asked her out, which was for a bet, so I'm not sure how serious he actually was, but when he first asked her out, she turned around, and she was living in cottage homes at the time, which for any of you who don't know is the sort of last vestiges of the workhouse. Parents had vanished for various reasons, was looking after her younger brothers. So she went through her weekly budget with him, how much she got every week, where all the money went, what was left. So she said, if you want me to spend any of that going out with you, you better flipping make it worth my while. And he said he knew at that moment he would marry her. But in the Northwest, all of the women that I know manage the budget. My dad has never known how much he ever earned. He's retired now. He didn't know where he banked. I once had to write a cheque for him because he didn't know how to do it. He gets pocket money every week, always has, never spends it all, saves it up for presents for my mum, and he has a MasterCard, but it's only to buy petrol with. So actually, it's the women who absolutely rule the roost where I come from in the Northwest in terms of money, planning, what we can do. But interestingly, it's always been drummed into me about saving money, because saving money gives you options. It gives you options for dreams, for doing something big. Not everything that you want to do, but it just means that when that opportunity comes along, you can say, yeah, you know what, go for it, let's do it.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that we need to reframe money from being about money to a type of self-care. I mean, you know, you look after your skin, you drink enough water and try to get to bed on time. So, you know, as a young person, I felt that there's a lot of stigma around frugality, but putting some money away today shows you care about your future self as much as the self you are today. And actually, when I have had savings, I look at that and just really thank myself a few years ago for doing that. So just on that point, Jo, we were talking earlier and you said that you see money as a kind of energy. Can you tell us about that?
I do think it's an energy, and I think that it can stagnate. So I think every woman needs a running away fund, basically. You need to have enough money that if you're in a difficult relationship or a difficult place in your life, you need to have that resource, because that is your freedom. But in terms of spending money, I think that if you leave it to, if you don't spend it a bit, it just starts to stagnate. And this became very clear to me in lockdown, where my annual income from things like public speaking and so on literally it was a fifth of what I was used to making. And I realised that by not spending £100 on, you know, going to support, I'm a huge supporter of local businesses rather than, you know, global corporations, etc. So by not spending £100 in that local shop, then that money was not being amplified as the owner of that shop then spent it probably locally, and then that person probably spent it locally. And so all that money was just kind of going nowhere. And I really learned an economic lesson during lockdown. The other energetic thing that I can tip that I could give anybody who is currently owed any money by a client is clean your office, tidy your desk, because it is, this is entirely unscientific, but every time I want to get paid by somebody, I clean the pile in the corner that's been really annoying me of all that paperwork, and miraculously money comes in. I don't have any explanation for it, but I truly believe that money is a form of energy, and it can be used positively, it can be used really positively. And I've always also, ever since I was a little child, given a lot of money away, and I didn't know where that came from until my mother died, and my dad went through her bureau, and she was somebody who'd only ever had housekeeping from him, and there were thousands of letters in there from charities and people that she had sent, you know, a £5 here, £10 there, or whatever. So, you know, I think it's something that you can put to incredibly positive use.
Mm. You know, psychologists talk about how when people are poor, it saps their cognitive bandwidth, and they literally don't have enough energy to focus on other things. It's like your intellect shrinks a bit because you're so worried about meeting your day-to-day needs. You know, I'm quite conscious that we are all women who have incomes currently, but at the same time, you know, this taboo about money really extends into the fact that people feel bad about worrying about it, and people at all income levels, I think, can still worry about money. You know, indeed, you'd go to your therapist and you'd probably talk about all sorts of things going back to when you were born and all of your relationships, but you probably wouldn't talk through your money worries about them. And I want to ask to both of you, have you ever worried about money at any point? And if so, how do you deal with the anxiety around that?
Oh, I think the first time I worried about money was I fell into exactly the trap I was talking about. The first flat I ever bought, I had no idea how much it was really going to cost. I knew about how much I was going to have to pay on the mortgage, but then the interest rates started to rise. I hadn't really factored in council tax, how much gas and electricity would cost, and the fact that I wanted to do it up as well. So even just buying paint and wallpaper and doing it myself was costing a fortune. And I was getting really worried about it, sleepless nights. When your expenditure constantly outweighs your income, you're just sitting there thinking, where on earth is this going to end? But for me, it was really about making a plan. It didn't matter how long it was going to take to sort out the debts that I racked up. And I look back and, you know, it's a couple of thousand. It really wasn't that serious, but it really felt like it was. But once I had a plan and I'd restructured things and given myself a bit more realism in my budget, I felt so much better about that. And then that would impact on everything in my life, and my health and my well-being, giving me the space and the energy to think of other things. So for me, really, it's about realistic budgeting and planning. Everybody's going to get into a fix from time to time. It's totally normal, with no shame in it, but sit down and make a plan. And if you need your best friend or a financial advisor or a parent, then sit down with them and put the plan together, but it will help.
If you really want to start worrying about money, start a business. Because, you know, sometimes you're employing other people, so it's not just you. The simple rule of starting a business is basically it's going to take twice as long and cost you twice as much as you thought it was going to. That's another law of the universe. We had times at Green and Blacks, many times, when we just nearly went bust because we were not being paid by the supermarkets who pay in 180 days, which is half a year, and we were having to pay our chocolate manufacturer in 30 days. So there were huge cash flow challenges. So I have lain awake many nights worrying about money. But the other thing, I think we were discussing this earlier, is that you are not immune however much money you have. I mean, I don't know if Bill Gates lies awake not worrying about money at night, but it seems to be fairly universal, anxiety about money. And also, I think another lesson that I've learned is being that if you are not content with what you have, then that way madness lies, and whatever level that is, because I know plenty of people who've made lots of money who, there's always someone with a bigger house, or a Renoir, or a yacht, or two houses, or whatever, you know, and so if that's how you measure things and measure your success, then, and if it's what your happiness is dependent on, then you're actually never going to be happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think personally I find that sometimes when I'm craving the purchase of things, you know, generally clothes and things from the high street, I think that I'm trying to buy the person that I want to be, and you never can. You know, there's no amount of makeup and clothes that will make me a different person. And you've basically touched on something, a structural point there, the fact that suppliers don't have to pay companies within any timely time frame, really, and that can cripple small businesses. Is there anything else kind of around that, you know, lessons that you had from your time as an entrepreneur that you think really ought to be changed or challenged?
Gosh. That's a very big question. You did warn me about that. No, I mean, I think that what we have to learn, and this is just a life lesson generally, here comes Jude, I can see her, is that you have to find a place of sort of centeredness and calm, so that when those crises hit, whether they are financial crises or other, you know, supply crises or the roof falling in or whatever, you don't fall apart. You are the calm at the centre of the storm. And so I think that's something else that we need to learn in school is how to be calm when the world's gone mad, basically.
Yeah. Welcome, Jude Kelly. Oh, I'm sorry that it took you so long to get here.
My helicopter. Just didn't turn up for me, so sorry.
The whole of the rest of the session is now Jude, which is fine.
I just had this realisation that this strange woman's going to sit beside me. Oh my God, being stalked. So I'm really sorry, everybody. I'm very apologetic.
Yeah, we've got one mic. Maybe you could start off by telling us about, you've recently set up a financial type education platform that's aimed at women. What was it that you wanted to address when you founded this?
Okay, well, those of you who know something about me, I'm a theatre director, arts producer, and I was, most of my career has been really building audiences and artists, commissions and ideas, bring them together. I was running South Bank Centre for 12 years. And I never really thought about money. That sounds a strange thing to say, and I'm now a grandmother. I have 2 children, 2 grandchildren, and I was one of those women who never really organised my pension, didn't really sort of think that money was something that had to matter to me as long as I had some. And it's only recently that I understood that, first of all, politically, that's kind of ridiculous to be in a situation where we've been so groomed as women to feel that money is somehow vaguely dirty, slightly embarrassing, and doesn't have to be our concern, provided we can be relatively solvent, which of course lots of women aren't, and then won't be as they get further on in their life. So what happened when I started the While We're in the World festivals, I didn't have money as one of the big agenda items. Obviously there were so many other things. And then about 4 years ago, I could put it on the agenda. Right, we're going to want money. Let's discuss money. We have to talk about periods and menopause and sex. And I thought that people were going to say things like, tell me about the percentage of my credit card or something. But in fact, the event was unbelievably emotional. People suddenly clocking that they actually didn't know whether their husband had a second bank account, that they actually hadn't the faintest idea really what their mortgage repayments were, that if they got divorced, average age 47, they had no idea what they'd really be in a financial situation. And so I was doing this with UBS, a bank, and they were a sponsor, and I kind of vowed there and then that I was going to not let this carry on, that women like me had a duty to girls to say we're going to have a completely different mindset about money from now on. So I set up Smart Purse with Olga, who was from UBS, basically as a financial education platform to discuss everything from let's not be embarrassed about the fact that we've never opened our access bill for several months, through to why shouldn't we invest sustainably even if we've only got 400 quid, and change the supply chain, change the whole idea of economics. And I mean, there's so much more I could say, but anyway, that's why.
Yeah. I worked at the Times as I was a reporter and a consumer agony aunt. I wrote columns, and one of the things that I found really quite moving was that I would often receive letters from women who weren't old, in their 40s or 50s. They'd had as good educations and jobs that were as high-flying as their husbands, but maybe they'd taken a bit of time out to look after their children. And the thing is that what happens is at some point somebody dies or the relationship fails, and then they are basically destitute because everything is online now. You can't just wait until he's out and then sneak into the filing cabinet and get out all of your bits of papers that show what your bank account numbers are. Some women would come to me and they would say, well, I've realised that actually I don't know what money we've got saving. I'm aware we've got assets, I don't know what they are. You don't know the passwords or anything to your joint account. And it's really difficult because obviously everybody marries for life and nobody lives defensively. You don't go into a relationship thinking, well, I've got to protect myself, but I mean, life is long and actually maybe you do. And when I was writing the book, so Jude mentioned that the average age of divorce is 47. Well, women live much longer than men, so my life expectancy is something like 94. I'm in my 30s, by the way, so some of you are probably 90. And kind of getting divorced, I had sort of bought into the myth that when women get divorced, they do well, that they take him to the cleaners, and actually that's a misconception because London has become the divorce capital of the world because we've got laws that are meant to protect women, that assets should be shared equally. So wealthy people from all over the world basically when couples get divorced, they race each other to see who can file for divorce in the jurisdiction that would be most advantageous to them. And if you're a woman and your husband is wealthy, you want to file for divorce in the UK, basically, which is why we've ended up in the papers with so many stories about, oh, you know, woman fights for this, that and the other, you know, and gets this massive payout from her wealthy husband. So those are the stories, but that's not the reality. Actually, what happens is that most women do quite badly out of divorce. So typically after divorce, the average woman's income drops by something like 10%, and it will be very, very slow to recover, if at all. And by contrast, when men get divorced, the line on the graph will show that on average, their income rises immediately and continuously. This, you know, I think really speaks to, again, you know, this kind of hidden problem of economic inequality and the massive gap between what we think about women and money and what is actually the reality. But, you know, so just talking to all three of you, money and relationships, I mean, money can often be a hugely charged topic to discuss with a partner. Have any of you ever kind of encountered that in a relationship, and how have you dealt with it?
Well, yes, on both counts. I mean, I was, I suppose, you know, professionally more successful and earned more money than my husband. And, you know, we're not together anymore. That's not the reason, but it certainly contributed to his feeling that, you know, how can he demonstrate that he was, you know, the husband, the man. And I mean, even though men may know that's completely illogical as a feeling, it's they're as groomed as we are. And I think that what I've discovered as well is that huge numbers of girls and women, I mean, and it's not, you know, only the case, it's not only kind of heterosexual relationships in which this is the case. I mean, let's be clear, there are all kinds of dynamics of power and insecurities and so on within all relationships. But certainly women do so much negotiation with their partner to make sure that their ego isn't bruised. And financial sort of power is one of those things. And I've even, you know, women have told me that they like hand their partner their own credit card underneath the restaurant table so that they can pay. And these are women who, at the same time, are actually coming along to meetings like this. So, you know, I know you're gasping, some of you, but actually I think most people do things that are about a kind of compromise in a domestic context in order to keep the peace, whilst at the same time saying that the world oughtn't to be like this, and I'll fight for a different world. And you know, there has to be a reason that women are going to be 5 times poorer than men by the time we're 60, and some of us are past 60, so we're already that poor. But the thing is that if we know that, and we've known this for a long time secretly, why have we found it so difficult to kind of show our muscles? And I think it's because we continually are frightened of hurting men's feelings, both at a personal level and at a society level, because we see the backlash.
Yeah, I mean, just to support your point, Jude, through the research that I've done, I found that even couples who are really egalitarian and talk about everything, heterosexual and same-sex couples, so I'm a gay woman, they fall into a traditional pattern of one person earning more, typically the man, and then one person basically not having very much in terms of money and assets at all, and that's because of the way that society is structured. Did either of you really wanted to come in there?
There is also a lady in the front row with a question.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to say, I'm someone who's started my own business, done that thing several times. I think one of the big things is that very few of the advisors that you can go to happen to be female.
Yeah.
And therefore when you are going to talk to, whether it's a solicitor or an accountant or a banker or whoever, quite often underlying that conversation about money, there's very little understanding about the angle from which you are having that conversation. And so anyone who wants to go into banking, accountancy or a lawyer and is female, please go for it, because there are lots of women out there who are put off by or misunderstood when they're in those conversations, even if they've sought them out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think amongst financial advisors, 85% of them are men. And I read some really interesting research that even when you go to a female financial advisor, well, the ones in the study at least, they gave female clients lower risk portfolios in the belief that they could handle risk. Whereas a fictional client, which a profile that had a male name at the top, was given something that was more adventurous and more likely to make money. I think you wanted to say something, Tracey?
Yeah, actually, just on that last point, it's interesting. I make sure all my investments are sustainable, and I talk to my financial advisor about that, and he's always saying, yeah, you know, you learn less though, don't you? But I push and I push, and recently I had to do a questionnaire about my pension, and he came back and said, oh, you're the first person that said no to investing in companies that support Sharia law. And they've actually realised that in the algorithm it was wrong because they hadn't had anybody say no to that. I was really quite shocked about that, which was interesting. Just going back to the point that we were just talking about couples. There's probably going to be people sitting here thinking, well, we're not going to get divorced, or we're not even going to get married, so it's fine. But everybody's going to die. And I can say that with confidence because I work in death and dying, and it shocks a lot of people, but everybody is going to die. And it's quite unusual for couples to die at the same time unless you're in a horrible accident. So it's really important to have that conversation because one of you will be left behind, and statistically it will be the woman. And statistically it is less likely that the man's pension will transfer over if you didn't have that conversation and you didn't talk to your financial advisor and you didn't buy an annuity that would cover both of you. But that's not the only consideration. There are lots of considerations to make sure that in the event, when the event happens, that you are both protected. And I can't think of a better reason for couples to have those conversations, not just to make sure each other's protected, but also children and grandchildren are as well.
Yeah, and actually I'd like a show of hands. Who in this room has written a will? Oh, good for you. And everyone else, go home and do it. Because it's if you think money is complicated when people are alive, it gets a whole hell of a lot more complicated when people die. Because all sorts of other emotions tend to come out. But in terms of my relationship, we have a joint account, but that covers all the kind of bills, any outgoings. But we also have our own accounts because I don't ever want anyone knowing, not even my husband, knowing what I spend on shoes or whatever it is. It's just, I got married when I was 35 and I was incredibly independent, and the idea of handing, giving all my money to someone else it's just inconceivable to me.
So I was just laughing because I went to see Rich Hall the other day, and he has a song which is "Don't Let Me Die," and then my wife sell my guitars for the price that I told her I'd get. But it kind of symbolises the idea that we do lie to each other about money. It's one of the big lying spaces, isn't it? How much did you pay for that? Oh, there's nothing, etc. When did you buy that? Oh, well, that about a year ago. I mean, this lying business around money is one thing. And then, of course, there's, taking other people out for meals, and there's lots and lots of stuff that people do. But I wanted to sort of pick up on what your point was about financial advisors, because the other thing about Smart Purse was we're trying to train financial advisors. We're trying to train women to be financial advisors and train people to think, actually, you go to a financial advisor because not just because you want to get rich, because you want your life to feel secure and positive and meaningful. And these are not words that at the moment the financial sector use. And you may have covered this already, but in terms of like women's businesses, so many women want to set up businesses to do things that are practical and needed and necessary, and often have a kind of community base. And they're very successful at it, but they cannot get any money. People will not lend them money. Only 1% of all venture capital, 1% goes to women-led businesses. I mean, that is such the inequality, it's almost unbelievable. And it's only 3% in the whole globe. And so there's a whole attitude that women shouldn't be lent money because they wouldn't know what to do with it if they had it. And at the same time, the venture capital system is geared, it came out of the whaling industry in the 1800s, but it's geared towards the idea that you throw a lot of money at lots of really wild ventures, but one of them will come really good and make you a fortune. So for every 9 that will crash, you'll have a Facebook. I mean, that's their sort of way that venture capitalists work. As far as they're concerned, the sort of more modest relationship that women often have with the idea of a business just isn't of interest, because you'll never get that rich, because it'll never scale. And so there's this constant unvirtuous circle where women can't get money to have investment. And so you can't grow the women's economy, which means you can't grow the value-led propositions that a lot of women's businesses have. And obviously that goes even further if you are black or women of colour, you know, all of those things that are intersectional about injustice pertain to money too.
Yeah, I mean, the government did a report on this maybe 2 years ago, and it found that there are 1 million missing businesses that would be run by women if they were able to get the capital to do so. And I think last year, when the COVID lockdowns were being lifted, we saw the value that the government placed on female-run businesses. So you could go out to the pub, but you couldn't go to a yoga studio. And these were all businesses, female-run businesses were the last to be allowed to open. Men could have their beard shaved with a blade, but a woman couldn't have her eyebrows threaded. You know, it was female-led businesses that were not allowed to reopen. I think, Tracey, did you have something you wanted to say on this?
Oh, I think the other thing that I wanted to say as well is that there's a perception that you have to go out and borrow a lot of money to start your own business. And actually, one of the things that I've learned through doing micro-investing through an organisation called Kiva, which is brilliant, is I invest small amounts of money in small female-owned businesses across Africa, and they always pay the money back. But you can start really small, and I think that as a society, we don't think that people who are living under the poverty line could start their own business. And yet most of the inequalities that we're talking about in Annabel's book is talking about poverty and the impact of that. My niece is 18. She's been trying to get a job for 2 years with Primark. It was her dream to work on the shop floor at Primark. She only got a Christmas job and then wasn't extended. She's now selling clothes online and making hundreds of pounds a week at 18. And the way that her confidence has shot up, and she's managing her own books and her own accounts, and her dad's helping her, he's self-employed, it's massive. But we don't think about that, and we are a nation of small businesses. So I think we need to talk an awful lot more about how women can start businesses at home, around the kids potentially as well, if, you know, around all of the obligations that they have and caring responsibilities. And I think we need to talk about a lot more of those stories, because people can, and you don't have to raise a lot of money.
Yeah. I think that one of the dilemmas that we have generally is that we know that we want value-driven work. We know that we think small is beautiful, and we want all of that valued, but it isn't. And so we're in a situation where we're trying to change society to almost depower as it sees it, you know, to de-escalate its growth. And that is perceived to be yet more womanly, famous. And that's the dilemma. The values have been so binary in the way they've been described that everything that women believe would be a good thing is sort of basically sidelined as, yeah, well, that's nice because it's for women. And so eventually, when the wellness industry takes over, do you remember we used to laugh at Jane Fonda and her lycra? Some of you will remember that. You know, it was very touchy-feely. Of course, men weren't going to touch it, were they? Lots of things. You know, electric cars were invented really for women because they didn't like to touch gears and do nasty things like those in the bonnet. Didn't take on at all. Nobody was interested until all of a sudden the guys took over. So once men decide it is of interest, then the value proposition shoots up. So I still think that we have got some real muscle power to bring to this, to stop feeling as if the only way that women can succeed is to play the same game at the same level. But to do that, we have to get right inside the political conversation, which is, you know, around growth, around the planet, and around holistic communities. So it's a big story.
Yeah. Some really great points have been made, very wide-ranging discussion. I wanted to leave some time if anybody wants to ask a question. There's quite a lot of people here. First, yeah. To this lady here.
I can talk really loud as well. I wanted to touch on the idea of education for women around things like retirement. I think my personal life is probably similar to lots of women's. I was married and I had children, so I took time off from my very good job, which had a teacher's pension attached to it, and then I was a stay-at-home mum, and then I got divorced, and now I'm self-employed, and I'm much poorer, and you know, I have started a pension, but like I've kind of always assumed that investing is for people who have many thousands of pounds that I don't have, and I certainly don't have a financial advisor, and I just wondered, like, I don't know, what's the answer to that? How do you get women to actually, I'm terrified about retirement, I'm 37 and I worry about it.
Well, certainly, I mean, I'm not trying to sell you smart purse, by the way, but I mean, that is one of the things we're trying to do. We're trying to say to women just like you and just like me, all right, you can put £500 in your bank account and it will stay there on zero interest and just stay there, or you can take 200 of those £500 and you can start investing it very carefully and slowly and learn how you build up a small portfolio. And apart from the else, it's actually quite fun. It's like, you know how you don't know how to do crossword puzzles and then you start having a go and then bit by bit, or gardening or anything. I mean, that's all it is. It's not a mystery. It's just a sort of learning as you go along. And I think several things happen. You feel as if you have more agency over your money. It's not just the NatWests sitting there. You know, you can make some decisions. And it gets you very interested in the way that the economics of the world is orchestrated, because you start examining what a company's history is and what its future could be. So I think it's very good for people who haven't got much money to start thinking they're still going to be part of the economic market.
Annabel's book is very good at talking about buying and selling shares, actually, so I would recommend investing in that. Just give you a bit of a guide, but there's a really good chapter in there about that. But the other thing that I would say as well, so it sounds like you have some investments, I would, or a pension in the past, I would write to them and ask them for projections. You want to know what that's already going to give you and give you a baseline so you can start making your plan.
I know.
You can get that information for free, you just need to write to them.
Yeah, great. There was a question at the back.
Yeah, hello. Do you need that for the report? Yeah. Hi, thank you. Hi, I'm sort of on the same theme around pension, because I think that's something that women don't think about a lot, but also on the theme of transparency. I'll give a little bit of anecdote. I went to my company that has now for 3 years running, or 4 years actually, since it started, recorded 20% gender pay gap within the organisation. I also have 2 children, so I've gone on maternity leave twice. During both of those, I was not contributing to a pension fund. So I asked them to calculate for me how much my pension fund had suffered, given that I was on average paid 20% less than men and had been out of the workforce for 8 months. They looked at me like I was insane that they were going to give me that information. And I'm just sort of wondering, how do we force companies almost to give us that? How can we get them, not to shame them necessarily, but at least give me an idea of where I stand when I leave the company relative to other employees? And they obviously have not given me an Excel sheet of these calculations. And I actually went to a lawyer and said, is there a regulation where I can force them to do that? And the lawyer said there isn't. So I actually have also no recourse to find out where I stand. So I'm just sort of curious about what the panel thinks of, if we can get to that.
I think the other thing is that it's really, really, really important and hard to get people thinking about pensions early on. I mean, you're 37, which is not, it's not old, and you've still got a long way to go, but actually, when you're 20 or 25, you just think, oh, I'm never going to be that old, I'll probably be dead by then anyway, and it's all so far off. And what we have to do is impress on them. I have a young woman working for me who I just had to have a really serious chat with, because she wanted to opt out of her Nest pension, which we were paying into, and was building her up, because as an employer now you have to offer a pension. And I was able to say to her that I'd made a very small contribution for 2 years when I was editing a magazine from 25 to 27, and I just took that pension, and it was like, bloody hell, compound interest, it's extraordinary. It was just a little community chest moment that I wasn't expecting in a really crap financial year. And so I had to sit her down and shine a bright light in her eyes and say, Georgia, I know you think you'd be better off having that, 60, 70 pounds a month now, but just stick with it because you really won't forget it when you regret it when you get there. But when you're 25, you feel invincible and you think it's only your grandparents that have anything to do with pension. So we've kind of just got to somehow get this idea into people's heads.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. We have to kind of rethink, in the sense that people actually do know they need to look after their teeth. So children do know that cleaning their teeth is going to be important, and by the time they don't want to look like they've got no teeth older. That looks horrible, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. So there are things that kids do have ingrained in them that's to do with ageing. It's just we haven't got money into that yet. You don't know what tooth.
No. But rebrand the word pension.
Yeah, it needs to be something.
It needs to be something like jackpot.
But I also want to address your point about how do you make companies give that information. And I mean, the answer is it would have to end up being part of legislation. And I just want to draw our attention to people like Gina Davis, who did the upskirting legislation. There's nothing to stop you personally, and I do think everybody needs to kind of think of themselves as a personal activist. Make some noise, write some letters, call it out. We collectively have to keep on saying this is not good enough. So the fact that we've now got to a stage where companies are forced to give their gender pay gap, it doesn't mean that they then have to solve it. That's part two, isn't it? But I just don't think, once you are enraged by something like that, I'm interested to know, how do you become a personal crusader and gather more people around you? Because somebody's got to.
Yeah. Just on a practical point, so your pension won't be managed by your company, it'll be outsourced. Do you get statements once a year? Yeah. So write to that company and they have to tell you, because they're working for you, it's your money. They have to tell you. Don't ask them, reframe the question. So basically say, if I had been earning this amount over this period, and I have been making regular contributions, what would it be worth? And they can model that. There's no reason why they shouldn't be able to tell you that.
Make it
You don't have to go through your company. Yeah.
I think that's great.
I'm afraid, I've got to wrap it up now, but I'll be around the festival for the rest of the weekend, and so we're going to be signing books afterwards, if you want to come down and have a chat. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out.